It's 9 o'clock. We want to get started because we have a very full program today. I'm Bill Sullivan, a member of the OSHER at Dartmouth Summer Lecture Series Committee. And please silence your cell phones and just locate the nearest exit to you in case it is needed, in the very unlikely case it is needed. And I'd like to welcome you today to the final presentation of the OSHER 2024 Summer Lecture Series, and I want to especially welcome our fellow OSHER programs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, the University of Georgia in Athens, and the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia. And I particularly want to thank our long-term sponsors for this program, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Estate Planning and Settlement, Doyle and Lohman Planning and Settlement, Kendall at Hanover, the Village at White River Junction, and the sponsor for today's session, the Taylor Community. And as you've seen on the screen here, please write down the questions you have for our speaker on the 5x8 cards that were given to you, and we will go through those at the intermission and ask your questions when we come to the Q&A at the end. There will be a post-lecture discussion after the Q&A at the OSHER building just a few minutes down the street. It'll be up on the third floor in room 308, and we encourage you to join that if you would like. Today's speaker, we're really privileged to have, is Professor Sally Paine from the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where she has held the titles of University Professor and the Sims Professor of History and Grand Strategy. She has an extraordinary academic and professional background in history and world affairs, and it would take me an hour to list all of her accomplishments, which she told me not to do, so I won't, but I'll give you some highlights. She has her bachelor's degree from Harvard, her master's degree from the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, a master's degree from Middlebury, right in Vermont, in Russian language, a PhD from Columbia in International Affairs. Her demonstrated areas of expertise include China, Japan, the Asia-Pacific, Russia, World War II, the Cold War, and maritime strategy. And she has authored, frankly, too many professional articles as well as 3 books. I can never mention them all, the list is so long. She is going to be talking at some length today. It's actually going to run to about an hour and 5 minutes, so don't sit anxiously at your seat. There's a lot to learn today, particularly at the end when she comes to the way forward. So let me now welcome to the podium Professor Sally Paine.
Thank you. I paid him for the introduction. I got to wait for my slides to come up. I've got to make, there they go. Before I begin, I've got to make a disclaimer. What I'm going to talk to you about, these are my ideas. They don't necessarily reflect those ideas, whatever you think the US government thinks, the Navy Department, the Naval War College where I work. So we're clear, these are my ideas. And complain to me if there are problems. I've been asked to speak about the way forward. But in order to do that, I need to talk about geopolitics first, because countries come in different flavors. I need to get that through that. And then I need to go through the strategies that were successful in the last Cold War as we plot the way forward and how to deal with the current one. So geopolitics, I'm going to do it this way. Start first talking about continental powers, and then maritime powers, and then when the Industrial Revolution comes in, it upends both types of empires, and then you get into the maritime rules-based order of our own day that's been evolving. For those of you who like animals, at the Naval War College, we love animals, and so we were often referred to land powers as elephants and maritime powers as whales, so I'm going to do all of that. Okay. Only a few countries can defend themselves primarily at sea if need be. This is the exception. The rule is more you have to defend on land. Think of Ukraine. It's defending on land is key. So for a sea power, you'd better have a pretty good Navy, and a land power, you ought to have a pretty good Army, or you could be in deep, dark trouble. And this is the first discriminating factor between land and sea powers. The United States began its life as a typical continental power. You know all about the Monroe Doctrine. That's typical continental fare of saying, that's my backyard, this is my sphere of influence, you stay out of it. And if you look at how the United States went in the 19th century, it's all about territorial conquest, right? There's the longest insurgency, counterinsurgency in American history, dealing with Native Americans. There are a couple of regional wars with Mexico. And then there's a lot of checkbook diplomacy, most notably with Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander II getting large chunks of land. And so Americans in this period are really proud of expansion. They got a name for it, manifest destiny. North America's ours, or it should be. And we tried to invade Canada a couple of times, but that doesn't work so well. But never mind. They had big friends, the British. But late in the 19th century, a different view emerges from this gentleman, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who looks at the world and goes, you know, actually, it's not territorial conquest and territorial consolidation that are the origin of power and position in the world. It's trade, making money. And he said, these are 6 prerequisites for a competent maritime power. And let's go through them. A, you got to have a moat. You can't have someone the ability to just invade you easily. A moat gives you relative security. You need a very good internal transportation grid to get the goods out in peacetime. You need coastal access to get your Navy out in wartime. You need a dense coastal population. These are the people who are going to be running all the businesses for your commerce-driven economy, which is another prerequisite. And then you need a government stability in order to run pro-commerce laws and also to fund a Navy. If you look at these 6 prerequisites and you apply them to China and Russia today, neither one has the full deck of cards. First of all, no moat. Each one has more neighbors and more hostile neighbors than any other 2 countries on the planet. And then you can look at transportation grids. Russia's remains lamentable. China's is getting better. Coastal access, well, great for Russia if your thing is polar bears and seals. Up north, it's useless. And China has got some coastal access too, but it's narrow seas where you will not get your merchant marine out in wartime. Dense coastal population, Russia, no. China, yes. Commerce-driven economy, Russia, never. China is now turning back to crony capitalism or whatever they think they got going on there. And as for stable government institutions, neither one. Because what is the litmus test of stable government institutions? That would be regular, transparent transitions of power. And dictator for life does not remotely qualify. So Russia and China may indeed have maritime aspirations, but they have a geopolitical setup that doesn't set them up for this. And it's unclear whether they understand this. Nice map of China. It shows you why the Chinese have trouble feeding themselves. And if you look where the flat areas are, a lot of them are in awfully dry or cold areas. And then let's overlay this with an ethnic map. The pink stuff is where the Han, the predominant ethnic group of China, live. They're surrounded by all these minority people. Here's a simplified ethnic map. And the curious might ask, how did the Han, who are in China proper, wind up with all the arable land, the prime real estate? And the answer would be, they laid waste to the competing Tibetan and Dzungar empires and any other ethnic group that ever got in their way. They don't, basically, in the game of continental empire, minority peoples are faced with a binary choice. Either you join and become nominal Han, or you better get out of Dodge because they will kill you. And I bet you've never heard of the Dzungars. They were wiped out a long time ago, and apparently in our own day, the Uyghurs are slated for genocide. I'm going to give you a sanitized version of Chinese history. I'm going to rip through it. It's got a lot of moving around and walls and all kinds of stuff, and they come and they go, and I don't know what they're doing. Anyway, there's less of them. And then there's this, the Yuan dynasty. It just looks like any other dynasty, but bigger. No, they're Mongols. And this is the Chinese sanitized version of it all. It's when they're a subject people they don't like to admit. Here's the real story of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. They're going in concentric rings over the Eurasian plain. But this is the largest empire in Chinese history. But then the Han are back with the Ming dynasty, which then falls to the Qing, second largest empire in Chinese history. These folks aren't Han either. They're Manchus. So when the Chinese today make these historic claims about what their territory is or isn't, they're either hearkening back to the Mongol Yuan dynasty or the Manchu Qing dynasty, where in Ironically, they're subject people. But the reason for all this map exercise is actually to show you lots and lots of expansion, lots and lots of shrinkage, and lots of bloodshed while this is taking place. China has been raising armies denominated in hundreds of thousands for thousands of years. The West doesn't do it, or certainly not on a regular basis, until the Napoleonic Wars. Here's Russia. They're like Mongols in reverse. They just go from west to east, the same kind of concentric expansion. Okay, if you have these interior lines that allow you to do this, that has certain advantages, but it comes with the disadvantage of numerous neighbors. These are Russia's, no kidding, security threats circa 1900, and there are lots of them. This is really different from Britain's 360-degree, you can't get me mo. Lots of people have come to get Russians over the years. They've suffered catastrophic defeats to the Mongols, the Swedes, initially to the French, to the Germans, and most recently in the Cold War. But each time the central position allowed them to rise again. All right, there are certain things that go on in this world. In this continental world, power is a function of land. Neighbors are dangerous. Even itty-bitty neighbors are a problem. Why? If they're unstable, that instability can bleed over the border. And if they're strong and bent on empire, that's even more dangerous. So in this world, the primary task of an army, number one task, is to keep the ruling regime in power. So when you think People's Liberation Army of China, they're the Praetorian Guard of the Chinese Communist Party. That's their job, keep the communists in power. This is not remotely what the U.S. Army is about. U.S. Army is about expeditionary warfare. Going across the sea is the expedition, not so in this world. The second purpose of the Army is to garrison the empire. You want to prevent defections. And only thirdly, is it going to be border defense. And oh, by the way, when whatever wars you're involved in this world, the fighting's on the borders and the winner takes the field. And it's very different from a maritime world. Okay, to give some math to all of this, of the problems with the home front, main front, if you're fighting on your borders, these are the deaths of World War II. And if you look at the Axis deaths, a lot of them, then you look at the Allied deaths of the land powers, also huge. Then you compare the two maritime powers, Britain and the United States. And by some statistics, they suffer fewer military deaths than either the Italians or the French. And the French weren't in the war that long. Then if you add in civilian deaths, the numbers become even more skewed. Why? Because if you're a continental power, you might well be fighting on home territory, particularly if you lose. And so civilian deaths are going to skyrocket, whereas for the maritime powers, they hardly budge. So no one in their right mind wants to fight on the main front if there are alternatives. For a continental power, there aren't. Look at Ukraine. Russia invades, you got a binary choice. Either you sit and take it, or you fight on Russian timetable. In the maritime world, it's a great matter of strategy of whether you get involved at all, and if you do, what the timeline is going to be. All right, now there are advantages of fighting and winning on this main front, as demonstrated by Stalin. Lots of Russians died, unclear whether he cares, but then he winds up dominating Eastern Europe for a number of generations. But it's expensive if this is what you're up to. All right, there are certain rules for playing to win in this environment. Rule number one, no two-front wars. Why? Neighbors are multiple and dangerous. You take them on one at a time. Secondly, no great power neighbors. Why? Because today's friend can be tomorrow's foe, and that spells trouble. So what do? You take on your neighbors sequentially. You set them up to fail. You destabilize the rising, and you ingest the failings and set up buffer zones in between to await the opportune moment to pounce and absorb. And this is Vladimir Putin's game. And better yet, you get the neighbors to do the work for you. You encourage all their mutual resentments. You deluge them with fake news. So they're already fighting and weakening each other so that Russia can play the game of the jackal state, the predator that comes in to steal the kill made by others. If you follow this security paradigm, there are certain problems with it. You're surrounding yourself by failed or failing states. If you look at Russia and China, you go, wow, they're surrounded by some of the most dysfunctional places on the planet. Are they just unlucky, or are they complicit? In addition, there are no enduring alliances in this world because people eventually get it. The hegemonic power spells trouble in the long run. And also there's no counsel on when to quit. And so there's a tendency to overextension, which may help explain the catastrophic defeats that have checkered Chinese and Russian history. So it's a really bloody paradigm. Incredibly successful prior to the Industrial Revolution. This is how the great civilizations of Eurasia did it. They don't worry about collateral damage or insurgents. They just kill everybody in their way and extras. Who cares? This world is all about taking territory, wrecking things, and killing people to get it. And you've seen it operating in real time in your own lives in Syria from 2016 to 2020 and in Ukraine recently. It helps explain all those ancient ruins. That's why they are ruins with this kind of warfare. All right, there's a hitch for the likes of Putin. If you botch strategy in this world, your known world can disappear forever, which is what happened to Imperial Russia and Imperial China, never to return. I love this picture of an aristocrat's whimsical palace in Russia. Those aristocrats, the entire social class plus others, are completely gone in Russia as a result of one of the great genocides of the 20th century. So the continental world is a world without insurance policies. Maritime world, it's really different. I love this picture of someone making it up about all the trade routes of the 19th century. You look at Atlantic, the center of the world trade in those days. It's all about this maritime trade, bringing wealth all along the coastline. And if you think about it in our own highly networked age, the seas are the original network that connected potentially everyone with everything. And the ancient Greeks pioneer this with their Rimland Empire of all this wealth-producing trade along the Aegean and Ionian seas. The Roman Empire, another Rimland Empire, very different from the consolidated empires of Russia and China. And think about the vocabulary, Mediterranean, Mediterranean lands. It's a sea among the lands. Whereas China, the terminology is Zhongguo, Zhong, central, Guo, kingdom. It's the kingdom among the kingdoms. So one paradigm emphasizing the centrality of the sea, the other the centrality of the land. But there was a route linking these two worlds, the Silk Road you know all about, and there was much fighting over the western terminus there circled in yellow. And for a long time, the Arab conquest settled that. They controlled it, and so they're making money off this east-west trade. The Crusades are a time when the Rimlands are up for grabs, but then the Ottoman conquest settles that for a number of centuries, and the Europeans need to get a little more creative. And this is when the Spanish and the Portuguese decide they're going to get to Asia the long way around, except they bumped in the New World, new to them, not so much to others, and they reassess and decide, okay, we're going to do heavy metals, the gold and the silver, rather than the high-end dinnerware. But the Dutch, then their empire, then is really defined by their trading ports, not taking large swaths of territory, but their position in Europe left them exposed, and they get conquered. So it's the British who really pioneer maritime empire. You think about it, they're the only country in Europe that doesn't have to maintain a large standing army in order to prevent immediate neighbors from invading. So the British can turn a weakness, their dependence on trade, into a strength, because that'll help fund a big navy, and then that navy is going to prevent anyone from invading because you're going to drown people at sea. The invading army is never going to make it. Now, so Britain doesn't have to maintain this large, expensive, potentially coup-generating army. Meanwhile, its neighbors are destroying wealth at a rapid clip, fighting each other. Now, Britain's navy is good enough to prevent invasion, homeland defense, but it is not adequate to make its continental problems go away. But if the neighbors are all busy destroying wealth, Britain's making wealth, no one can invade, it potentially puts time on Britain's side. And the British eventually develop a very potent grand strategy for elephant hunting, for dealing with your continental problems that are trying to upend the global trading order. They had a generation of warfare with Revolutionary France and Napoleon, where after much trial and much error, the British figured out how to integrate multiple instruments of national power, coining the term grand strategy to explain it. because navies are rarely decisive in wartime. You can rarely use a navy and achieve whatever your political objective is. So the British have to figure out what to integrate with it. And here's their strategy for elephant hunting that they developed. Rule number 1, keep the economy growing. Make sure you're making money, because it's going to fund your own army and whatever you're going to do to subsidize allies. Don't let the elephant forage. You want to close down enemy trade, and that day was done by blockades and commerce raiding. Rent an elephant. Find the continental power most threatened by whatever your continental problem is, and you want to fund and arm that power to keep them in the game on the main front. Rule number 4, fight in a peripheral theater to this main theater, one that is accessible by sea, so that Britain's going to have an easier time getting things to and from theater, and therefore it's going to suffer lower attrition rates. And what's this going to do? It'll have cumulative effects on the enemy because their attrition's going up. It also, if it goes well enough, it should relieve pressure on the main theater, and it's going to force your enemy to fight on divided attentions. Rule number 5, a rule that the British violated at great cost in World War I. For goodness sake, don't get involved on that main front, certainly not as your opening move, because the land power's great strength is its dominant army. That's not Britain's strength. Britain's strength is its navy, its ability to generate wealth, and therefore to endure a protracted war. So if you're going to get involved in that main front, only do it after you've really bled the elephant and severely weakened it, and then only get involved with lots of friends. Now, as much as a continental power might want to play this game, it can't. Why? Because it has inadequate naval access. These narrow seas close in its navy in wartime. It cannot deploy. Also, it has a surfeit of landward neighbors who might invade and cause problems. But if the Britons played this game, it put themselves and its enemies on opposing trend lines. While Britain's getting wealthier and wealthier by trading, its enemies are just wrecking themselves and their economies fighting often on the enemy's home territory. So Britain's going to win the thing by exhausting the enemy first. Now notice this paradigm relies not so much on the military instrument actually for Britain as on economics, coalitions, and institution building. But there's certain prerequisites if you want to try this. A, you've got to have sanctuary at home. If someone can easily invade you, you cannot play this game. You also need access to markets, access to military theaters, and you need institutional instability so that the home government can maintain its strategy over a long period of time. And these are some of the factors that Mahan would later emphasize. Okay, this brings me to the second distinguishing characteristic between land and sea powers, and here's how it goes. Continental powers, just by geography, they have to focus on contiguous threats. So they're going to be looking at insulating themselves from neighbors and establishing buffer zones to prevent people from invading. Whereas maritime powers have relative security. So they're going to focus on national prosperity, which they're going to get through commerce, and then use that money to then buy their army or whatever they need for national security. So they're all about maritime access and open seas, whereas the others are for closed seas. So if you put it together, the inability or ability to defend at sea and this preference for open or closed seas, you get two mutually exclusive international orders. One of the continental world orders divide things up into spheres of influence and each a rule unto itself, and the others, no, we need to have universal rules, shares of seas in common. Okay, the Industrial Revolution upends empires of both types. Why? Because it introduces compounding growth, which over several generations just upends the hierarchy of nations. And the Industrial Revolution is a combination of technological and institutional changes. They begin in Britain after the Napoleonic Wars. They make it to the continent and have been running around the world ever since. And it's a tremendously disruptive event for traditional civilizations. They've done nothing differently, and all of a sudden they're dealing with the industrialized world on their back-footed. And you think about our own day, ISIS or wherever is left of it is absolutely opposed to this incoming maritime order and reviles the liberal economies and societies where it comes from. And China has always been profoundly ambivalent about it. And what the Industrial Revolution does is it changes the currency of international power. Formerly, power was a function of land, right? That's where you get your resources, commodities to be sold. That's where peasant conscripts come from, is the land. Well, once you have compounded growth, your power is going to come from industry, commerce, and trade. And it just upends the balance of power among nations, and we're still dealing with the consequences of it. And if you think about diplomacy in our own day, it's, much of it is all about coming up with rules for commerce. All right, this man is part of the event that is making this maritime order so profitable. Malcolm McLean ran a trucking company, and he decided to put the trucks minus the chassis on ships, what we call containers. And it dramatically reduces loading costs to almost nothing, and the loading times go way down so that it's so cheap to send things by sea. And then these container sizes are standardized in the late 60s to run 1 if by truck, 2 if by sea, and thousands if by, 1 if by truck, 2 if by rail, and then thousands if by sea. So that in our own day, where we got the latest dictator for life, Xi Jinping, who thinks he's going to do his Belt Road choo-choo train initiative, good luck with that one. And here's why. This is the math. Back before 1960, the average tanker size, a mere 20,000 deadweight tons. In our own lives, the minimum size for an ultra-large crude tanker is 250,000 tons. If you think about what railways can take, 600 containers maybe, these large container ships take, the biggest ones, over 21,000 containers with cargoes worth over $1 billion. So there is no way land transport can compete with this. Moreover, for that Belt Road thing to work, you got to control it end to end over some of the most unstable places on the planet. Also, it'd be nice if the track were the same gauge and were continuous, otherwise you're loading, unloading. Well, it ain't. Moreover, if anyone cuts that, what do you do? Whereas in maritime world, you've got an unstable part of the world, well, just go around it. No need to pay protection money. And these maritime routes are accessible to places like China and Russia only in peacetime. Why? Because they have narrow seas. They will never get their commercial traffic out in wartime. Whereas the people with direct ocean access can convoy and get it through that way. If you think of our own lives, the miracle of our times has been the explosion of this maritime trade. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And look how it skyrockets after the end of the last Cold War. Goodbye, good riddance, Soviet Union. And it leads to a very prosperous inter-Cold War period when people are busy trading with each other instead of countering each other's insurgencies. All right, this brings me to the third distinguishing characteristic between maritime and continental powers. So it has to do with trading on interior versus exterior lines. The land lines are interior lines. The oceans are exterior lines. So continental powers, they're running their security through these interior lines of communication to garrison their empires, to deploy their armies at will, and it allows them to have a contiguous alliance system if that's what they want to do. Maritime powers are running their trade through exterior lines, and they're all about access to global markets, access to wartime allies, and this gives them the possibility of having a truly global alliance system. So if you look at it, there are powerful differences that geography delivers between maritime and continental powers. Okay, the Industrial Revolution puts empires on notice that, particularly continental ones, on notice that this maritime stuff is so much cheaper. It also introduces this compounded growth and the possibility for a positive sum world order. Think about the continental world order. It's negative sum. It's all about fighting for spheres of influence, destabilizing each other. You're destroying wealth at a rapid clip. Why is it negative sum? Because if you're fighting over stuff, the goods get damaged. So the loser's loss is greater than the winner's win because you're wrecking things. Okay, so this is the wealth-destroying mechanism. If you look at the maritime order, it's all about win-win trade deals because no one's going to run deal number 2 if you ruin them in deal number 1. This order is not about destabilizing people. You want people to be stable so you can run very lucrative trade transactions. And the system is based on freedom of navigation, free trade, international laws, and institutions facilitating that trade to minimize transaction costs so everybody can make money. Now, for a lot of little countries who have to deal with big countries, what they've learned is if you all stick together and if you've got a rogue nation you're dealing with, you can all come together with multiple instruments of national power and to deal with even fairly large problems. And this is the insurance system of the maritime rules-based order. It was created by the World War I generation, who are conscripts in World War I. They returned after that war to try to raise families during the Great Depression. And then when they rose to strategic leadership positions in World War II, they had the sorrow of sending their children and grandchildren off to war. And their solution to Great Depression and global war was institution building on a global scale. And it's incredible what they did. They built the UN, they built NATO, they built the predecessor institutions of the EU and the World Trade Organization. And these institutions have held this peace in the developed world until Putin invaded Ukraine. But they tried to create these institutional solutions so that we can all deal with our differences by talking it out rather than killing each other. All right. The continental world is all about positive objectives. An operation, it's like positive objectives are making things happen, negative objectives are preventing things from happening. You can see the positive thing. The negative thing is invisible if it doesn't happen. So at the operational level, these continental goals of blowing up neighbors and stuff, it's highly visible. But at the strategic level, it leads to depressed growth. That's a problem. Whereas the maritime world is truly invisible of what's going on. For instance, if you look at navies, they're all almost, not always, but almost always about negative objectives. It's the bad things that don't happen. So navies focus on, one, preventing the destruction of the global trading system. That would be high value. They are about preventing freedom of people interfering in freedom of navigation. Can't do the trade if that's going on. Another high value mission. Navies are also about helping deter territorial expansion. You think, well, what's the fundamental principle of international law? It's sovereignty. Just because you're big doesn't mean you can go ingest someone who's small. And if you think about the instruments of national power used in this maritime paradigm, it's alliances, diplomacy, sanctions, embargoes, containment, and then navies, deterrence, blockade, commerce rating. And all these negative objectives of trying to prevent anyone from doing horrible things, they yield a positive strategic objective, which is compounded growth and wealth. So if you're doing this, you're probably working on containing the rogues. It doesn't make the rogue disappear. And, but what you're doing with the sanctions is you're trying to depress enemy economic growth by a percentage point or two a year. And it doesn't make the problem go away, but if you're continuing to grow and they're not growing as fast, it becomes huge over several generations. So think about North and South Korea. Because the alternative of trying to solve the entire problem all in a go, particularly if the rogue has nuclear weapons, that's a costly mess. And it will so wreck wealth and things. So this is the maritime game. Now, at the end of the last Cold War, the optimists thought that, well, hey, it's going to be liberal democracy all around. Except the continental maritime struggle continues. And here are just the two of the most notorious rogues. They're Mr. Fit and Misfit. Putin and Kim, who they want to wreck our international institutions and international law and undermine our alliances to return us to this Hobbesian spheres of influence fighting that will reduce us to the kind of squalor their own citizens have to endure. So to summarize this portion, continental and maritime powers are distinguished by their inability or ability to defend primarily at sea, their focus on insulation from or access to the world, and their reliance on interior or exterior lines of communication. And from these accidents of geography and preferences arrive some real distinctions. Continental powers tend to look at territory as something they can potentially take or dominate, whereas maritime powers are thinking in terms of markets to make money. Continental powers are thinking about economic self-sufficiency, whereas maritime powers, it's about access to markets. Continental powers are about exclusive zones. Maritime powers are not only about oceanic commons, but cyber airspace commons. So although most countries are neither continental nor maritime strictly, there's a corollary that powers that don't bend one way or the other easily can join the maritime paradigm by the friends they choose and the institutions that they choose to belong to, and show up in force when the rogues go rogue. All right, China, more than any other country, has benefited from returning to the maritime world under Deng Xiaoping. But now they seem to be, their continental predispositions are coming back. And the choice is consequential, because continental powers typically hemorrhage cash in order, they're usually dictators, to dominate their own populations and their neighbors. Whereas the maritime world is all about making money. So we shall see what the Chinese do. All right, part 2. So that's the geopolitical setup. Now for the last Cold War, on why it turned out the way it did. Can we learn anything from that? Many will argue that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War, and there are lots of arguments and counter-arguments, so that's going to be the structure of what I talk about. So for those who argue that Ronald Reagan did it, they would emphasize his military buildup and say, hey, the Russians simply couldn't keep up with it. Except this picture taken after the end of the Cold War at the Reagan Ranch, where the Gorbachevs and Reagan seemed to have a grand old time, doesn't seem to fit with that explanation, if that's what really happened. But here's a Russian. I'm going to be quoting many Russians today because they thought really deeply about what happened to their country, why they lost the Cold War, why they lost the empire, why they lost the world as they understood it. And this one, Valentin Falin was a Soviet ambassador for Germany for a long time. He said, look, following the American strategy of our exhaustion in the arms race, all of our social services, quality of life fell apart. And given that Russia was involved with an arms race with China as well, it just plunged the Soviet economy into a total crisis. So also Reagan was busy funding anti-communist insurgencies the world over, most famously in Afghanistan. And here is the Soviets' prime North American expert, Georgy Arbatov, saying, look, and we got our Vietnam in Afghanistan, and we began to understand this. So some would argue that US victory in the arms race guaranteed victory in the Cold War. So if you believe this, go Ronnie. All right, now here's some other external explanations of what others did to the Soviet Union. And I'll start with Ford Cardin and the Helsinki agreements. For years, right after World War II onward, the Soviets really wanted to hold a European-wide conference that would confirm their expanded World War II borders. Long time, no one wanted to do it. By the 1970s, the Europeans are sick of all the drama. It's like, let's just settle this stuff with the Russians. United States, unenthusiastic, but we go along with our allies. And then if we're going to do this, we're going to demand human rights clauses. We know they're not going to, Soviets aren't going to honor them, but we're going to include it anyway. Well, unbeknownst to everybody, once the Helsinki Basket 3 human rights things are signed on the dotted line, dissident groups throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union started holding their governments accountable, saying, look, where is the communist liberation you promised versus this dictatorship you've actually delivered? Why aren't you implementing the things that you have signed? And the dissident movement took off. And then you have Jimmy Carter, who comes right in with his human rights campaign. And here he says poignantly, we have affirmed America's commitments to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. What draws us together is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than mere financial prosperity. We are bigger than that. It turns out that the human freedoms that the political freedoms that Carter emphasized were precisely the ones that Eastern Europeans were being denied and sat in the center of their attention. And here you have a long-term career diplomat saying, look, communist ideology is most associated with the Soviet Union. When it gets rejected, we're into free fall. And so some would argue that it was the human rights clauses of the Helsinki Agreement and Carter's subsequent human rights campaign that destroyed communist belief in communism. Okay, another president, another counter-argument. Others would say, no, it's Richard Nixon. And he played the China card. Turns out, Mao had his epiphany during the 1969 Sino-Soviet border war. The Soviets come to the United States and say, would it be okay if we nuke them? And we go, no way okay. And Mao figures it out. The one that wants to nuke you, that's the primary adversary. And great minds think alike, and you have Nixon sending Henry Kissinger secret trips to China, lining up Nixon's very public trip in 1972. This forces a really expensive Soviet militarization of their long frontier with China. They already had a militarized frontier with Europe, but now they're going to have these mechanized nuclear armed forces all over China, on the Chinese border. Well, think of this, if this country had to have those sorts of forces along our Mexican and Canadian borders. It would be bankrupting. And our economy is a lot larger than the Soviet economy ever was. So some would argue that US cooperation with China fatally undermined the Soviet Union, and that was that. Others would say, you know, it isn't any one president, but it's a whole succession of them, that each one opens opportunities to the ones who come after. So Nixon plays the China card, which others play with increasing dexterity. Ford opens up human rights. Carter runs with it. Carter begins a military buildup that Reagan then completes. And it allows the United States to deal with the Soviet Union from a position of ideological and military strength. So another point for those who believe that US foreign policy wasn't consistent in the Cold War, don't get it. It was relentless of free trade, democracy, containment. That's the staples of US foreign policy in that period by both political parties. All right, so some would argue that Presidents Nixon through Reagan produced the cumulative presidential effects to defeat the Soviet Union. Others would say, no, it's not about presidents, it's about this military platform, the nuclear sub, because once we start coming up with a way to deploy it, it puts into question whether the Soviets actually have a retaliatory strike that would, that they'd be capable of it. And so here you have Marshal Akhrameyev, who's visiting the United States in 1987, and he tells his hosts, we're surrounded. You know where our submarines are, but we don't know where yours are. You, the United States Navy, are the problem. Go Navy. So if you believe this, you would argue the Soviet Union couldn't counter technologically or financially the US submarine threat and to its retaliatory nuclear forces, and so they had to call the whole thing off. Okay, these are all naval explanations spelled with an E, as in staring at your own. And we need to get beyond the half-court tennis to move away from Team America to look at the other side of the tennis court net to see what the Russians were up to. And I love this quotation from Arnold Toynbee, who was one of the finest historians of the 20th century, who said that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. So the explanations I've just given you are all the murder explanations, whatever others did to the Soviet Union. And now I'm going to go into the suicide ones of what they did to themselves. Okay, explanation number one. The problem was it lost the Cold War because its empire fell apart. The empire didn't fall apart because they lost the Cold War. This is the primary cause. You know about the domino theory, that all the capitalist countries are supposed to go down like dominoes. Well, it turns out that applies to not to capitalism, but to communism. Because once the human rights demonstrations begin in one East Bloc country, the contagion spreads to the other so that there's so many of them. And then their leaders no longer have the stomach for the kind of violence that would be necessary to put them down. And Gorbachev's ideas of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, rebuilding, resonated throughout Eastern Europe, where Russians are all about political freedoms and liberation, and Eastern Europeans are about liberation from Russia. The Russians missed that detail. But it's also about fixing broken economies. And Gorbachev encouraged all the ferment. He wanted Eastern Europeans to reform economically and politically to fix the whole thing. The reforms began in Poland. Poland had been subject to incredible unrest from 1956 onward. In 1980-81, that's when you get the development of Solidarity, the workers' movement, illegal, but it has a national, international reputation. And then by the time the next wave of unrest happens in 1988, the government tries to raise prices because the economy is a mess, and the strikes are just devastating the country. The communists are worried about the economy going to free fall. And they tell Solidarity, call off the strikes and we'll bargain with you. And Solidarity does it at the round table talks that take place in the beginning of 1989. And here's some Russians' famous advice to the Poles. Hey, you're an itty-bitty country. You'll just make some itty-bitty mistakes. So we'll learn from your itty-bitty mistakes, because if we make mistakes, they're going to be catastrophic ones. Got that one right. So the Polish Communist Party thinks that it's set up the electoral rules so it cannot lose. Not quite. Solidarity wins every single seat for which it could compete but one. The Communist Party, which is competing for communist designated seats, wins only 3. And you ask yourself, how could that be? Oh, well, it's because the winner on the ballot was a box called none of the above. At that point, there is not a shred of legitimacy left for the Communist Party, and democracy is on the way. Note that the day of the elections happened to the day that Deng Xiaoping calls out the tanks on Tiananmen. 2 very different solutions. Now, in Germany, very uncharacteristically, where the unrest spreads next, did not send the tanks, because would-be tank man here was already out of a job. He'd been in power since '71 and totally mismanaged the economy, so the whole government is basically resigned until whatever's left of it issues some new travel rules. And this chump, who's there at a news conference, instead of admit he doesn't know the answer to a question, he's asked, when do the travel rules go into effect? He says immediately, okay. Then crowds start gathering at the 6 gates to East Berlin. And the border guards at one of them decide discretion is the better part of valor, and they open the gate. And another pivotal choice has been made, like the Polish elections, that once you make a pivotal choice, there is no going back to the way the world was. The crowd flows into West Berlin, and by the end of the week, you have over half the East German population that has visited West Germany. So it's going to be over for this system. So here you have Anatoly Kovalyov, who's deputy foreign minister for a long, long time, commenting on all of this, because he and Gorbachev and others had thought that Eastern Europeans would congratulate Gorbachev for liberating them and forget about all the Stalin stuff. And in fact, according to Kovalyov, there was no confidence on with all these massive crowds about whether the German army would shoot us or them. And the same thing applies to the Polish and Hungarian armies. Okay. So with allies like this, you better bail. So unrest in the empire caused the Soviet Union to forfeit the Cold War. Okay, another explanation, totally different, has to do with overextension of the Third World. So here's the world circa 1960. And see all those green places? Really tempting. They're all about to become decolonized. And they don't particularly like their Western colonizers and enter the Soviet Union with a plan to put the West out of business. There were many takers. Fast forward to 1980, and you look at all the reddish places. The Soviet Union is on a roll. It looks great, except with the global recession of the late 70s, tank commodity prices. These places are all really dependent on commodities for their budgets, so their budgets are being halved. One of the commodities that's tanking is oil, and at peak, I think the Soviet budget, 55% of it was funded by oil. So the Soviet Union couldn't afford all this deep bench of non-performing pals. Better yet, as all this mess is happening, the Soviet Union's own nationalities are rising up, demanding independence. And remember, the cardinal rule of continental empire is no 2 front wars. Well, there's so many fronts going on that no one can keep count. So you could argue that the Soviet Union bankrupted itself in the Third World while ignoring its own internal Third World. So these simultaneous revolts bring down the empire. Okay, another explanation. It's none of this. It's the Soviet economy. It's the failure of communism as an economic system. Here are the statistics. The Soviets do pretty well right after World War II. By the 1970s, they're into catastrophic decline of their growth rates, so that in the 10 years before Gorbachev took power in 1985, Soviet growth rates either 1% or 2% less than those of the United States, and this has enormous compounding effects. So they just have plummeting economic statistics. And here's what's going on. Communism incentivizes all your subunits in an economy to lie to each other. Why? Because you want to make sure you got enough input so you can manufacture or do whatever you want to do. but if you don't lie, you'll probably not get enough of these things. So everybody's lying to everybody else. There's no good macroeconomic data. So guess what? After a while, people are grossly misallocating labor and capital because they have no idea what its true value is. They don't know what real productivity is. No market. Who knows what consumer preferences are? So by the time they start realizing they have a little problem on their hand, it's metastasized into a full-blown crisis. Soviet Union is routinely losing 20 to 40% of its crops to spoilage. And then this requires grain imports that they can't afford. It's a total mess. So Gorbachev, when he starts doing his reforms, growth rates are going to go negative. It's a total mess. So here's Marshal Yazov going, look, NATO, all these rich countries, we can't keep up with this. We got to find an alternative to the arms race. So some could argue that the Soviet economy lost the Cold War. Okay, famous line from Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote the famous book about the destruction of the monarchy in the French Revolution. Tocqueville observed the most dangerous moment for a bad government is when it starts to reform. And people of all political persuasions in Russia agree on one thing, that Gorbachev's role was pivotal in how things turned out. And here is one of his buddies who wasn't too happy with him. Gorbachev made a number of incorrect assumptions. One was that the direction of history is irrevocably forward towards communism, never backwards towards capitalism. And of course, the Eastern Europeans did precisely that, a U-turn back to capitalism. Also, here's Chernoyev, who, like Gorbachev, is assuming that the dominated peoples are going to credit Gorbachev for liberating them and forget about all the Stalin stuff. And so he said, look, these countries brutally turned their backs on us. It was totally unexpected for us. Really? You roll in your army, you don't leave, you shoot the government that's there, you install your guys, you siphon off whatever wealth you can from the economy, you impose a non-performing economic system forever, and you're surprised they don't like you? Oh, good. I mean, think about this country. We intervene in civil wars the world over, and we dump billions of dollars into all sorts of things for them. And then we even leave. They don't like us. I don't know why the Russians think they're so special. Okay. A third assumption is Gorbachev assumed that if you get rid of the Warsaw Pact, NATO's going to go too. And if you get rid of Comecon, that's their trading organization, then the European community, what becomes the EU, is going to go too. Wrong. Two of those things are still around. Also, Gorbachev assumed the United States would take a continental view where continental powers are allergic to other strong powers, and that the United States, of course, is going to oppose German unification. So all the unrest is going on in East Germany. Gorbachev's off on vacation, poor life choice, because President Bush and Chancellor Kohl are actually working behind the scenes for the fastest reunification of Germany possible and put the unified thing into NATO. All right, so many of Gorbachev's followers, after it was all over, blamed him. They said, look, his foreign policy mistakes were a function of his domestic mistakes, and this collapsed the Soviet Union. So it was suicide by mistake. The big bozo was playing with plastic bags. He stuck one on his head. All right. Others would argue it's a problem. It's not the sins of commission of what Gorbachev did, but it's a sin of omission, what the army failed to do. That they should have done the Tiananmen thing, just send in the tanks. It would have been brutally effective. Deng did it. So their idea would be that timely tank deployments, TTD, that's my contribution to military acronyms, would have changed the outcome of the Cold War. Others would argue, yeah, it's a leadership problem, not Gorbachev, not military. It's this charmer, Boris Yeltsin, who comes in after Gorbachev. He removes Article 6 of the Constitution, which guarantees the leading role of the Communist Party, so there's going to be competition for elections. And then he seals the deal at these Bielorussia Accords with Ukraine, where you got Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus signing away, saying the Soviet Union is no more. So, you know, suicide on purpose. Okay. There's another way of looking at all this, is some umbrella explanations. One of them is any of the above. There's so many problems. The outcome of the Cold War was inevitable. Or the opposite conclusion, it's all of the above. The West barely won. So any of the above. You can just look at it. There were so many problems with communism. It was destined to go, right? And the West had been telling the Russians, don't do communism. It's brutally inefficient. And by the end of it, the Russians didn't like it, and they invented it. So it was inevitable. The opposite conclusion is no, 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 no. It took everything, the entire menu. If you remove any one of those items, the Cold War ends differently and not on Western terms. So count your blessings. It ended the way it did. Another twist on this is say it takes not only all these unfortunate events, but it takes the confluence in office of two very talented leaders. President Bush, if you look at his resume, he starts out as a congressman, and he goes on, he's ambassador to the UN, first representative to China, and then he has 8 years of warm-up as VP for Ronald Reagan. And then Chancellor Kohl is the longest-serving German chancellor since his illustrious predecessor, Otto von Bismarck. And Kohl, the moment he comes into office, he's starting to work on unifying with East Germany by buying one tourist at a time. Turns out the East Germans love to travel, but then they stay. And all of a sudden, the East Germans are letting more people travel. And the question would be, well, why? And the answer would be money. They've got this non-performing economic thing, so the West Germans pay them a lot of money, more people travel. West Germans pay the Hungarians a lot of money to let Germans out through the Austrian border. And then you get this incredible tag team diplomacy between Bush and Kohl that is just too fast for Gorbachev to react to. And it's first getting Gorbachev to agree to a unified Germany, then to agree to what was West Germany, to keep it in NATO, and then to allow also Eastern Germany to have unified Germany in NATO. And as the stakes go up, so the checks to Gorbachev get huge. Gorbachev is dealing with an economy that is spiraling out of control and worried about whether he can even cling to power, so he's desperate for the cash, and that's why it works the way it works. But there was a fly in the ointment, and it's called the Iraq War, that happens in the middle of this. It happens before the German Unification Treaty is signed. And also, the last Soviet troops don't leave Eastern Europe until 1994. Until that happens, the end of the Cold War is not a done deal. George Bush finesses this. And he also finesses Margaret Thatcher and François Mitterrand, who really don't want a unified Germany. Regardless of what they've said in public, in private they don't want it. Why? Because they know full well unified Germany will eclipse their own country, which it most certainly has. Mitterrand eventually finds solace in becoming one of the key people negotiating the Maastricht Treaty that creates the EU and that's going to incorporate Eastern Europe right on in. Margaret Thatcher just plain lost. She had hoped to keep some Red Army troops in Germany for the duration. Imagine how it would be today dealing with Putin if we had Red Army troops in Germany. It would not work well at all. Okay, promised ending, way forward. Now what? What do we do now that we're into Cold War II, which I guess began somewhere like when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, or when maybe the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. All right, if I go back to part one, about strategies for elephant hunting. Here's the key difference then and now. Britain used this strategy very successfully in World War II. Key difference is precision nuclear strike. So we do have sanctuary from invasion in the United States, unless things go catastrophically wrong with Mexico, so we ought to pay attention to Mexico. But we do not have sanctuary from nuclear strike. So by all means, keep the economy growing, keep the economies of our allies growing. By all means, close down enemy trade. You probably don't want to do it by military instruments in the past blockade and commerce rating. Use legal instruments, right? Sanctions, what you will or won't buy or sell. You want to help your beleaguered continental friends who may be fighting on a main front. And you may indeed want to stir up trouble on peripheral theaters. But you want to do all of this cautiously, because you don't want to so corner the continental problem that they strike out with a nuclear strike. In addition, if you look at the maritime world then and now, the goals and the instruments haven't really changed. Rather, the consequences of mistakes with this nuclear strike possibility have gone way up. So last time around, the West, Japan, South Korea, did indeed parry the nuclear threat. No one was nuked. They did indeed maintain really robust economic growth. In fact, it's incredible. And that also went global. Meanwhile, the Soviet and the Chinese economies are languishing by their economic policies of their own choice. And eventually, the Chinese and the Russians conclude that their only way out of their poverty is to start rejoining the maritime world, which they did during the inter-Cold War period, which accounts for rapid, even more rapid global growth. But now they seem to be making a U-turn back to their continental predilections. Lest you despair. Remember the last Cold War, where they're doing the dumb stuff and living lousy lives as a result? As I recall, people were doing quite well in the West, traveling around, have nice houses, compounding the wealth. So we probably have a long wait on our hands as the Chinese and Russians start doing a negative sum event that's going to be negative sum for themselves most especially as we await for them to reassess. All right, if I look at the strategies from part 2 about the last Cold War, I talked about why the Soviet Union lost, but from that you can derive what the United States was up to. And one of them was having a very robust military buildup. We did this in coordination with our friends, because you want to deter invasion of your friends, and we pretty much did that. There was a very robust strategic communications campaign far beyond human rights and far earlier, and this is with Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, BBC, Deutsche Welle, which is getting accurate information to subject populations so that they can begin coming to their own conclusions. And it also involved very robust diplomacy. Part of it focused on alliance busting of the enemy alliance, and part of it focused on amplifying enemy mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes fell under the category of overextension. The Soviets were overextending in Eastern Europe and across the globe, dominating people. It's costly to do that. Moreover, wherever they got there, they were abusive, which actually makes it more difficult to dominate people because they don't like being abused. Surprise, surprise. And then they're imposing this non-performing economic model that is wrecking the Soviet Union as well as the people that it's dominating. So the West was engaged. If they're going to do this suicidal stuff, well, let's help them out. And it's assisted suicide of amplifying their mistakes. So I would suspect the next time around, we're going to be helping. If you're going to do stupid things, okay, we'll help you do that. Understand that without the West doing anything, geography contains Russia and China. So here's Eurasia, their home address. Eurasia is surrounded by narrow seas, and forget about the stuff up north. It's, even if you can go by it, there's nothing there, no population. So that in peacetime, this is not a problem. Everyone trades in these places. In wartime, their merchant marine is not going to get out. In the Atlantic Alliance and Japan, the merchant marine is going to get out, provided you convoy it, and by external lines dealing with your friends. So that'll be okay. Also, if you look at these continental problems, their primary enemies don't align. The United States is indeed a shared secondary enemy, but let's look at it. Russia's primary enemy right now is Ukraine. China's primary enemy, that's a good question. Is it Taiwan, India, or if it gets dragged into Central Asia as Russia's losing its influence there, it's somewhere there. It's not the United States. And then Iran's primary enemy, I believe, is Israel. Pakistan's is India. North Korea is South Korea. None of this aligns where they would make really meaningful sacrifices for each other. They got a transactional thing, but I don't know about meaningful sacrifices. Also, think about it. Putin's trying to play empire in the age of nationalism, which is just wealth destroying. It's no longer feasible because occupied people no longer sit supine and take it. They resist. It's incredibly costly. Also, last time around, Russia was strong, China was weak. This is reversed. China's done this Belt Road event deep into the former Tsarist and Soviet sphere of influence, peeling these countries away from Russia. Russia's dumping all of its ordnance and its Cold War arsenals into Ukraine. Okay, who's protecting Siberia? And you might go, well, I don't know, who cares? But if you're looking at all of this, Putin's engaged in a hot war. In the Cold War, the Soviets were really careful not to do those. You have proxies doing those. It's wiping out its Cold War arsenal, and China can come on in. And Ukraine has no history of going after Russian territory. China has a long list of places it wants back. In fact, the Tsars took from China, Chinese sphere of influence, more territory than the United States east of the Mississippi. It's a large territory. Moreover, there's another very pressing issue, and it's called water. The Chinese have just wrecked their environment. They have gone through their water table, and North China desperately needs water soon. And there is only one quick fix. It's called Lake Baikal, which has over 20% of the world's fresh surface water. It's over the size of Belgium. Okay, if they do that, that's going to be fun. So the issue isn't whether this Sino-Soviet cooperation is Sino-Russian cooperation is going to end, but when. And there's a real cost for misidentifying your primary enemy. Nicholas II, back in the day, thought, oh, he'd do the Russo-Japanese War, Japan would be his primary enemy. So instead of taking that money and investing it to protect himself from Germany, he dumps it against Japan, loses that war, and a decade later he loses World War I. That cost him his dynasty and his entire family, himself included, their lives. Okay, Putin. Now you're into Ukraine that never was trying to go after you in the first place. And we will see how all this plays out. If we play our cards correctly, the Chinese and the Russians will take care of each other. But I suspect it's going to be a long wait because we're fundamentally awaiting them to reassess, to realize that what they are proposing is negative sum for themselves most especially. And so in the meantime, we need to cooperate with each other, making sure we're all growing economically and keeping Ukraine in there and things like that as we await Russia and China to reassess, rejoin the party, and return as friends once more. So that concludes the remarks I had prepared for you all.
I must say that's one of the best lessons in history I have ever had. We're going to take a break for 30 minutes, so you want to be back here now with 30 minutes from now. It's 10:07, add 30, you got it, at 37. And this is time for a social session down one story, and then we're going to come back and do the question and answer session. And please bring your questions either to the basket up here or in the rear of the auditorium. So we'll see you in 30 minutes. Thank you. We have far more questions than we could ever deal with, so I'm sorry if I leave yours out. I just had to put it together as best I could. What was the whistle about?
For you.
But before I get to any questions, I have to read the first card that I read. It said, "No question, but I wanted to say that Sally was the best presenter of this entire series." And this one could probably take an hour, but I'm sure you can summarize it all. If all we have to do is wait, how can we mess this up?
Overextension. We have a real capacity to intervene all over the world and try to make choices for other people that they need to make themselves. So let us work with our allies and parts of the world that are welcoming to the kind of aid that we can provide, and let's work on making all of that better. So right now, the Ukrainians are most welcoming of our help, and they're doing the hard stuff. So by all means do that. But as for invading and sticking around in places and trying to make a full-up democracy, understand in Taiwan and South Korea, they actually did that. It took 3 generations, and they did it themselves. And it started with their own decisions to invest in infrastructure and education of their young. And then eventually they had a middle class. Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. And then they had a middle class that was large enough to demand democratic rights. So overextension, you can absolutely mess it up with overextension. Also, if we do something that's too aggressive and winds up with a nuclear strike on us, we had trouble being rational during COVID when the issue was, do you wear a mask or don't you wear a mask? I mean, really, it's trivial on or off on the mask compared to if someone takes LA out. So let us work on those other things.
There are a lot of maritime questions. I'm going to kind of read several of them and let you put them together in one answer. China now has a larger, at least in quantitative terms, Navy than the U.S. In view of this, do you believe that the U.S. would be able to deny China's sea trade? Question 1. Is our Navy building enough ships of the right kind to ensure deterrence? Is China trying to become a naval power by building in the islands in the South China Sea and in the relationships with Pacific Island nations?
Okay. Step 1. I am no expert on naval force structures, so I can't answer that part. China has, by geography that I went into a little bit with those narrow island cluttered seas, that if it decides to get itself in a global war, which would be insane from its point of view most especially, it is not going to be able to deploy its Navy reliably, that the odds of getting it mined or removed from their inventory are just too, on those kind of seas, don't work. So knock yourself out, China, build a Navy. Maybe it has advantages because it means they can't do stuff by land, but in wartime that Navy, it will not yield the results, the benefits that the Royal Navy did for the British or ours did in World War II, because it's different geographic setups where you can use these things. As for trade, we do not have to deploy the Navy to deal with Chinese trade one way or the other. That's where sanctions come in. It's what are we going to buy, what are we not going to buy, and you handle it that way. So it's not a naval problem at all. I suspect the real naval problem is going to be the one that Navy's ignoring, which is convoying. If it really gets bad, you're going to have to be convoying your merchant marine. Like there was some admiral who recently said, oh, there's nothing I can do about the Houthis, there's too much going on. Yeah, you can. Convoy the stuff. Every other war, this is what has been done. If that's the problem, merchant traffic not making it through, you convoy it.
One question you talked about the narrow seas in China. It says, what makes China's east coast limited by narrow seas?
Okay, you can have fun with your computer when you go home and you can go get a topographical map of all the oceans, and you can get a sense of where they're deep and where they're not deep. Deep is helpful for submarines and where you can hide them. And shallow means that if you're trying to get and narrow means that they can be mined or they can be targeted. So if you look at China, this is of where they can come out, it's through these very predictable, what are called choke points. And it's just a fact of geography. And if you study history, you can look at Germany and the 2 world wars. This is their problem. They have these very narrow seas. They can get their U-boats out. That's about it in wartime. And even that's a problem, trying to resupply them by trying to scoot them back home. It's difficult, and it only works in World War II because they control France with its open ocean access. So China doesn't have that. It's got island chains. It's different.
With all the technological changes that are going on in warfare, would drones, Chinese drones, be a threat to U.S. Navy and its capability to maintain its superiority?
I don't know the details on that. I would imagine the answer is yes. Isn't the story the Ukrainians are demonstrating to us daily? We should learn from them because the U.S. Navy has not fought a peer competitor since World War II. That is a long time ago. Ukrainians are dealing with peer competitor. Also, the United States loves to buy what they call platforms that are so expensive you can't afford to lose them in wartime, and that is a problem, right? Wartime, I think if you look at like tank inventories and stuff in World War II, you're replacing the whole thing multiple times in this war. You're going to be losing all this equipment, and the Ukrainians are proving to us the utility of drones and the advantages of not having pilots on things where you're going to have to, each pilot's at least $1 million, probably more in all the training that they get. Well, a drone's much cheaper. So yeah, we got to start thinking seriously about drones, and apparently our drones are a total ripoff. They're too expensive to lose. The Ukrainians can't play that game. So there's a whole, we are down to too few, I think, military suppliers. We need to reintroduce a little more competition, and that's definitely in our future. But I cannot tell you the details of these things because you have to have a real expertise on military platforms. That's not what I know about.
Could you comment more on the Chinese-Taiwan relationship, where it is today? There's been a lot of economic exchange in both directions. Is Xi truly likely to carry out his threat, and does he understand the threat to China of that kind of war?
I have no idea on what Xi thinks. Only a psychiatrist knows for sure, and maybe he shot the guy if he said anything. But really, if you look at what I consider the pillars of legitimacy for rule in China, one of them is ethical rule. It goes back to Confucianism. And for a while, the communists compared to the nationalists had that one sewn up. They seemed to be more ethical than whatever the nationalists were up to. Another source of ethical rule is prosperity. Is the empire prosperous? And under Deng Xiaoping, yes, it was. Okay, those two things, no one is saying there's anything ethical about the Chinese communists unless they're the ones who are saying it. They're the ones who are doing genocide up in Xinjiang. Their economy is, now that they're doing the continental number of jailing their best capitalists and relieving them of their assets and going back to crony capitalism, that's out. They haven't had double growth rates, I think, since Hu Jintao. So it's a long time, something like that. Anyway, but the last thing that remains is nationalism. And that's where Taiwan comes in, because the citizens of the People's Republic of China of all persuasions agree that Taiwan should be theirs, okay? And so Xi Jinping's going to leverage that. So his number one goal is not Chinese prosperity. I believe his number one goal is to keep himself alive, that would help, but the Chinese Communist Party in power. So when you're measuring what they're up to, you need to think in terms of that. So under Deng Xiaoping, when he's opening up the economy, making people more prosperous and helping the Communist Party, that runs in tandem, so that all works. But you reach a certain level of development, and what do your more prosperous middle-class citizens want? Well, it's probably political say. Well, the Chinese Communist Party has said that's off the table. So now, in order to stay in power, we're down to the nationalism card. And I have no idea what Xi Jinping's going to do. He probably doesn't know what he's going to do, right? All of us. Do you know what you're going to do next year, this day? I don't think you do. You might have some ideas. But I think we need to take him very seriously at his word. So the Chinese have said forever they want Taiwan back, and Xi Jinping is much more insistent about this. So let us help the Taiwanese to make it as costly a proposition as possible for him if he does this idiocy. And it will be so wealth destroying, it will be incredible. And those chip foundries that he wants, they will be smoking ruins. They will go on day one of this thing. He will not have them.
And given that the Xi is kind of concentrate more power into the Communist Party in terms of economic decisions in particular, how can we apply assisted suicide here?
Oh, I think it's what we're doing. It's with the sanctioning. And I think when in the inter-Cold War period, it made sense having these cheap supply chains where it's all over the world to a certain extent, except we cannot forget our own working class who need jobs. And then a lot of these goods that we imported just break instantly. And the American-made goods, while more expensive, were higher quality. They're actually cheaper. Anyway, I think the assisted suicide is we got to bring supply chains back. And also, we need to help fix Mexico and Central America, because if that place is the raging dumpster fire that it is currently, this unrest is on our southern border is bad. And we need to help, probably need a 40-year development program of what can you do to have more and more legitimate businesses so that people can prosper that way. They won't want to become flying over our border if they have perfectly good jobs at home, and gangs aren't trying to dragoon their children into them. So there's a lot to do with our allies and friends. Listen to them. They all have very good ideas. And we've gotten so far by listening to them as it is. I mean, it's incredible with Ukraine, with all of our Western European allies, and people complain, oh, NATO, it's so slow. Well, actually, as one of my wonderful former teaching partners, a Navy captain, said to me, he said, you know, NATO is the most efficient organization to coming to a consensus of 31 different parties. That it takes time, but when they do, it's powerful. So let's work with each other. And also, what can we also do at home? I'm speaking to a particular generation here. Let us get the young to dial it down on our own domestic stuff on politics. Of just, by all means, disagree, but do it in a non-disagreeable manner. And threatening to kill people because you disagree with them should be an absolute non-starter. So this is one thing that our generation can help the young out with, is just dial it back. Stop hating each other. It's not going to get us anywhere.
And relative to Ukraine, what are the Chinese objectives relative to Ukraine? Is this seen as an advantage, a disadvantage to them? How does it affect the relationship with Russia?
Oh, I think it's great from the Chinese point of view that the Russians are just getting wrecked. Now there's a negative, is you don't want dictators to go down because that doesn't look good, but they don't particularly like Putin. So yeah, I would think it's great. And then they don't like us too much, so they probably don't want an unmitigated yippee-yi-yo democracy conquers all. They won't want that, because that doesn't make them look good. And that's one of the reasons they hate Taiwan. That Taiwan is just, the Taiwanese are everything they're not. This wonderful, democratic, prosperous country that is a rebuke to communism and all it stands for. So I would think the Chinese want this thing to go on and on and on and on. And then the question is, they've got this Belt Road initiative, so they put all this money in building infrastructure in a part of the world that can't possibly pay for the infrastructure. China's now run out of cash, and so it's going to be trying to squeeze money for cash. It's a mess, but I think ultimately the Chinese just love it, that Putin's wrecking himself, and then I'm thinking they're going to restore the sphere of influence to themselves. It would be advantageous for us if they would focus on doing that rather than attacking Taiwan. And one of our strategies would probably be to help them go move inland and have these wonderful parts of the world. Afghanistan, beloved diaper is yours. Enjoy. I think something like that.
The nature of the Chinese-Russian relationship, we're best of friends and everything else. And, we've got a lot of history shows that hasn't been true for border issues.
It never was.
Yeah, it never was. Yeah, isn't this today just simply a transactional relationship?
Yeah. I think, but to me, it's the maritime order that is this miracle that human beings finally realize, hey, if we cooperate with each other and we have rules and we don't stiff each other on cheating on the rules, it allows us to make so much money. It is such a win-win. Mm-hmm. Why would we ever want, and you think about in our lifetimes, the Germans and the French are going at it forever. It's over. They're just sorting things out by talking to each other. And Eastern Europe joining the party. And eventually, I hope that Russians and Chinese will reassess and rejoin, but we can't make them reassess. Those are their decisions.
Shouldn't the United States, and this is somewhat related to China, but not directly, have helped Russia when it began to fall apart at the end of the Cold War?
I haven't gotten to the Clinton archives. I've done a whole bunch of other archives, and I'm unclear how much of the Clinton stuff's been declassified. It's interesting, when I was in the George Bush Sr. archives, so the whole thing's falling apart, and it's interesting, the Poles were really proactive, this new government that's coming in, and they're saying to us, the United States, hey, we don't understand banking, we don't understand finance, we need a bunch of your experts to help us with these things as we try to transform into a market economy. And they were really proactive, and we sent all kinds of people over. Whereas the chit-chat in the Bush archives is the Russians think they know everything. And yeah, Americans do go over there, and was it Jeffrey Sachs and friends, and the advice doesn't work very well. I think there's another problem with our country, is we like to play half-court tennis, which is just look at Team America. What works for Team America is going to work for team on the other side of the net, and that's nonsense. And there's a problem with the discipline of political science. So when our government hires experts, they're quite often political scientists, which it's a worthy discipline, but as part of their graduate education, they should be required, if they're going to do anything that's international, to learn the relevant languages. So we're getting people who are shooting off their mouths about the Middle East and stuff, and say, well, that requires some Arabic, Turkish, Farsi, Hebrew. If you know those four, that might get you going. And we haven't, and then we're just totally shocked that, oh, they didn't behave the way we thought. No kidding. Right, so this is something that we can also work on. We've got Dartmouth next door. Dartmouth could simply make it a requirement. You want a PhD with international relations, and you're saying this is your region? Okay, let's pass a high-level language exam. There's no reason the students can't. They're perfectly smart.
Let's see. You've stressed the importance of the rules-based order to the survival and success of democracy. How well do you think that U.S. citizenry understands the rule-based order and how they actually benefit from it?
Not
and
at
I'm
all.
asking this because there's a trend toward isolationism once again.
Not at all. That's why I gave the lecture. Right? Yeah, not at all. And this America First business and isolationism, it's old. You can go Google Dr. Seuss and America First, and you'll get his 1941 cartoon that is published a week before Pearl Harbor, where it has Mr. Isolationist on his deck chair going, America First, going, oh, nothing's going to happen to me. And like a week later, like everything happens to you. We live in a shared world. And the reason we're strong is not because we're alone strong, it's because we have so many friends. Mm-hmm. That is our security. It's in numbers, the ability to gang up even on a very potent-sized rogue together. If we dump NATO, which has been suggested, that is idiocy. It is, boy, talk about a self-goal or whatever it is. Others are working on our assisted suicide, right? They have weaponized the social media. They are deluging us with fake news. And now Mickey Mousing around and inventing things that people did or didn't say or do. And it's very easy to lie. I can do it instantly. The sky's purple, right? Okay, I've lied. Then the disproving it then takes a good deal of time. So we need to work on this. And the divisions of America exist. They're there. But boy, they're just available for others to foment. So again, generational. What can you do in your retirement? One of the things is helping the young dial it back. Not in a mean way, but in a, hey, just, it's okay. The miracle of this country is that we can have all kinds of different opinions and ideas and do different things. It's not the liberty to tell other people what to do. It's the liberty to make your own choices. And we got a group that wants to make a certain narrow set of choices for everybody. They need a big hug and a time out saying, hey, let's back off from this. You may be in power now, but then tomorrow you may not be. So let's do something that works regardless who's in power.
Related to something you just said too, as a previous speaker, Chris Walker, who's from the National Endowment for Democracy, emphasized in his talk, and he also has a new book out on this, on the uses of sharp power by both Russia and China to attack us internally. What are the various tools of sharp power, and how effective do you think they are being, particularly from China's point of view?
I'm not sure what his definition of sharp power, did he list instruments?
Yes, the ability to affect things via the social media we have, the propaganda, the Confucius Institutes in the case of China.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know whether I'd call that sharp, but anyway, that would be strategic communications in my books. But hey, I haven't read whatever I'm supposed to have read. What I would say is, well, at the end of the last Cold War, or during the last Cold War, we had this really robust strategic communications, which I alluded to with all the news services, Voice of America, BBC, which are about getting accurate news out there. And there was also something called FBIS, the Federal Bureau of Information Services, that if you worked through the government, they would do translations of just every manner of newspaper so that you had all this information coming in. Well, all that's shut down, and I'm sure you're as well aware as I am of how lousy the print media is now because they can't afford to send correspondents everywhere, and local newspapers have gone. So we've got a problem now on our hands where everyone's not watching Walter Cronkite anymore, who just delivered sort of a vanilla version of events that tended to be accurate, that we don't have this anymore. And what I noticed with President Biden with the Ukraine invasion is all of a sudden it's like we shut down our information warfare stuff. It was like right after the end of the Cold War, because why do it? Because we're all friends now. I think Biden must have put it back in, because remember when he was sharing all that intelligence before Putin invaded and saying, hey, they're coming? The Ukrainians didn't even believe it. And what it did is it just killed Putin's information warfare. It was done. And also mentioning what false flag nonsense that he would try to promote. Biden preemptively got rid of all of that. And the head of the CIA, Burns, very smart man. In fact, he gave the best talk I've ever heard at Texas A&M when I was there. It was giving kids career advice. It was just fabulous about how you can work for the government, do this and that. But we now, I think we're back on doing the information. And we've been offline for a generation, and it shows. But stick with the truth. It's a good thing. That's all back to Americans being nasty to each other. We've also normalized lying. And none of us likes being lied to. Also, how can I make accurate decisions if a lot of what I've got are lies? So that's another thing on people, is to get them, honesty truly is the best policy. Just stick with it, be honest. And that's another thing we need to get back to. But I think we're coming to terms with the social media, and I'm not sure how that story plays. We had hoped that it would make democracies more powerful. Now we're scared it makes authoritarian countries more powerful. We have all sorts of wonderful young people in Silicon Valley. And leverage that. We have the best IT companies in the world. There's no way we shouldn't be able to sort this one out.
Democracy is seen by authoritarian states, especially China today, as a real threat to their power, both internally and more broadly. Yep. And in 2013, the Chinese Communist Party created a document that stressed the need of the party cadre to attack, and I will quote, Western constitutional democracy, universal values of human rights, civil society, neoliberalism, and Western journalism. That's a full-fledged attack on democracy.
Yeah, it is. It's a continental world. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely correct. It's interesting. So I was at the Hoover Institution, and they had a Chinese scholar there. And it was right about that time. Apparently, as soon as Xi Jinping came in power, he got all of his Russia experts in. He convened them around the table, and he said, why did the Soviet Union fall apart? And they're telling him why, and he's taken notes. So the document that you're talking about reflects the lessons that Xi Jinping learned. Mm-hmm. And he's looking at Gorbachev trying to open up politically before he fixes his economy, which turns out to be a mistake. And by the way, it seems like we often do this to people. We say, you got to hold elections now, long before you've got an economy that works, when in fact it's maybe the other way around that truly works. If you look at Taiwan and South Korea, very repressive societies, but they are very actively trying to fix their economies, and maybe that is actually the way to go, that actually works with human beings. But the lessons that you see there are it's not going to, this Cold War is not going to end with like the last one with the Gorbachev who thinks communism is going to survive this, but we're just going to open up and be nice to people. It won't end that way. I don't know how it's going to end. But those are the lessons that the Chinese have derived. And yeah, it's, you may not be at war with the Chinese, but they're at war with us, with our world order, the way the Bolsheviks were from 1917 on. My end of career book is going to be a history of the Cold War, and it begins in 1917, and we didn't figure it out that the Cold War was on until it really got ugly after World War II. But the communists have been trying to undermine the capitalist order from the day they took power.
China has been rumored today to be really building up its nuclear capability.
Yeah.
Does that change the dimension in any way, or is MAD still effective?
I don't know. I don't even know MAD was effective the last time around.
Well, it didn't happen.
Yeah, I know, yeah, but then the counter of these negatives is, oh, well, they never tried, right? And so it's one of these things you will never know the answer. Mm-hmm. But I do think that if you get into anything hot with the Chinese, hot war, where you're trading gunfire with them directly, and then you start winning that thing, they're going to up the ante, and then I would be terribly worried about the Xi Jinping decides that this is my last day on the planet. Well, you know what? The whole planet's coming with me. Kind of, yeah, right. So we're better off not doing that. There was a British diplomat, and it was years ago when the EP-3 plane went down, and the Chinese served this surveillance plane, and the Chinese took it apart and wouldn't give it back, and blah, 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 blah. And some British ambassador was advising our guy and said, the Chinese are always getting themselves into crazy positions, and you want to build ladders for them so that they can step their way back. So I think that's another piece of it, is don't try to corner them. Don't try to get into the operational win. You want the strategic win. The strategic win is when they change their mind, rejoin the world order, and start making money and return to the last inner Cold War period.
What appears to be China's goals in the Middle East? They are establishing close relationship with Iran. They have actually had the two Palestinian groups over in China recently, trying to get them to talk to each other. They've had discussions with Saudi Arabia and so forth. Do they have a strategy for the Middle East that we can understand yet? I haven't seen one.
Oh, well, A, I don't know. B, whatever it is classified by them. And you need, if you knew, your security clearance would be way up there, and there's no way anyone would be talking about that to you. So my guess, and it's always a guess. So one of the things in life is one should always reassess and change your mind instead of just digging oneself in. So, I mean, I voted for the wrong people many different occasions. It's like, okay, you reassess, you learn, try to do better next time. The Chinese certainly want energy security as best that they can get it, and so obviously they care about Middle Eastern oil flows. I also believe that they want a Sino-centric world order. Now, I could be wrong about this, so just watch the data and see whether it confirms or disproves what I'm telling you. If it disproves, change your mind, think of something else. But I think they want a Chinese world order, and that involves the United States going back to its box, and the smaller the box, the better. And so, of course, they want to maximize their influence all over the world. They're up and at it. And their plus over the Russians is that at least they build infrastructure, which is beneficial to people, whereas the Russians just, they've just become so predatory now. They send in their Wagner or Wagner renamed group in there, so that's the hit squad of whoever's in charge. And then they give Wagner some gold mine, and then the Russians are just simply taking gold bullion back to Russia. And meanwhile, the whole country is just churning and is never going to develop economically. Whereas China actually wants some stability. Yeah, in fact, I was listening to something that was like Fareed Zakaria was saying that Russia benefits from instability because commodity prices go up, whereas China, resource poor, stability doesn't really help them. So Putin is a double negative, but he's just ruined himself, and he's ruined his country, and it's playing out. Regardless of what we do, it's playing out. And then China, of course, is the bigger problem.
In Southeast Asia, and I will throw India into this, how would you describe their attitude today toward China, where they think they can benefit and where they think they have to be careful in those relationships?
Well, I think they always have to be careful. China's huge. So careful you got to be. The Vietnamese can't stand the Chinese, so they're allergic to the Chinese. Also, the China's water shortage, so it's got Tibet. This is where a lot of the major rivers of South Asia begin. The Chinese are damming these things, which just totally upsets everyone down below, apart from just trashing the environment and doing all that stuff. India has no love lost for the 1962 Sino-Indian border war. Nehru was really generous to the Chinese. He recognized Tibet as part of their country, which those kind of recognitions under international law, you can't recognize borders and then de-recognize them later. That's illegal. That's what Putin did with Ukraine, but that's a no-no. So Nehru does all this stuff for China, and then China invades India in '62, and Nehru's whole not spending money in the military, foreign policy goes up in smoke. He dies fairly shortly thereafter, but ever since India's been building up a sizable military, and China is probably India's primary adversary. It used to be Pakistan, but after the Bangladesh independence in '71, that splits the Pakistan problem. So, yeah, India's going to be watching China very cautiously. On the other hand, India's always had very cordial relations with Russia, and it wants to get cheap oil, and so that's their plan.
And China seems to be working to develop closer relationships with parts of the Soviet Union, and that is the stands.
Yes.
Where does that headed? Where's that going?
I think the story is they're returning to the Chinese sphere of influence. It's ongoing, and with things like Kazakhstan, which is a really big one, is, what is it? I think it was starting to do things that were helpful to Ukraine, which is unprecedented. And then other ones are just, China has run some really interesting border treaties with some of them, which their governments signed on to, but never made public, which is a weird thing to do. Normally, these border treaties are public. One suspects that Dictator A gave territory to China, signed on the dotted line, and hasn't told his population that whatever, these mountain passes are now Chinese. So, yeah, China's sphere of influence is going to go in there. China, I don't believe, can do both a big maritime, if they want to have some maritime war, and a Central Asia event. So I would think from our point of view, the deeper into Central Asia they go, the better. Go have at it. These are some of the most unstable places on the planet. So then if you're going to do assisted suicide, you would want to facilitate that more than allowing stuff to make it really costly to go into Taiwan, so that the low-hanging fruit is elsewhere, inland.
What's been the Russian reaction to this so far, and to the incursions into the stands?
We don't know. I bet the CIA knows. I can't imagine it's happy. Putin has totally blown it. In fact, just this last week with the incursions into Russia, what is his name? He's one of the prime oligarchs who's saying, I think this is a bad idea, fighting with Ukraine. We'll see if he walks out of a 6th-floor window or not in the next week or two. But yeah, it's negative sum. And Putin is not going to reassess. He's going to just up the ante, up the ante, up the ante. And we'll see how long it takes, whether he has to, I don't know, get something interesting in his Cheerios, or we have to wait till he's 90 while this goes on.
Potential areas of conflict between us and China, South China Sea.
Yeah.
What are their real goals, China's goals?
Oh, I think they're honestly a continental empire. And they're looking at seas, the way you look at territories, you dominate it. And the point is, okay, South China Sea is mine. Look at the weirdly they define it. They define it all the way to the shores of people like 1,000 miles from them, right? And it's very continental, and it's self-defeating. Apparently, all the islands that they militarized there, think about where fish lay their eggs. So they have basically decimated the environment of the South China Sea. They've just wiped it out. These were some of the most, I think, prolific fishing grounds. It has to do with, I don't know, where new species arise from and things. They've wrecked all of that. And so they want to dominate these things. So I guess we got supposed to have rising seas. So you're going to take this little reef that's like this much above the ocean, and you're going to put some expensive base there, and you put some guys there who need fresh water, by the way. And then you think in wartime that's going to work for you. It's an environmental mess. It's a total waste of money, but it's the way they look at it. I gave you the continental predispositions. This is how they look at it. Xi Jinping is not a well-educated guy. His education happened during the Cultural Revolution when they got rid of all the educated people. Yeah, he's got a degree. Great. I don't even know that where is Beida or wherever it was, Beijing University, wherever he got, or Xinhua. I don't even know if it qualifies as a degree mill when he was there. So they perceive the world differently. That's why I did the continental maritime. Understand others look at things differently. Get across to the other side of the tennis court net. Demand that those in public office hire people who have expertise in this area. You don't want just a bunch of linguists on your staff, but have some who can actually read things to sort out what you're going to do next.
I'm going to get back to an earlier one, because I want to hear a little more about it. And that is that, the part of the failure of the Soviet Union was the excessive concentration of power within the Communist Party, particularly relative to the economic matters. But I see Xi doing exactly the same thing now.
Yeah.
Is this a lesson not learned, or?
Well, it's like Eisenhower. Not Eisenhower. Einstein, isn't it like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results? I mean, yeah. It's the way it's going, and a great lesson for us is you want a multi-party system, at least two. So you really don't want it in our own country to be down to one political party. You could see what happens if that's what you do. You get fascism at best, or if you're really stupid, you get communism. So multi-party is definitely the way to go, because it forces you to hear the counter-argument. And if you refuse to take the counter-argument on board, and if the counter-argument is accurate, then you lose the next election. That's what the reassessment. If you personally aren't willing to reassess, the voters are willing to help you by getting you out of a job. And then I gave you all of those explanations for why the Cold War turned out the way it did. I don't know the answer. I mean, those are the things, the best explanations I've seen, and then you can put it together any way you want to. But in a lot of our policy, when we make decisions, you have incomplete data, or the data you would need is unknowable, or you can't possibly find it. And so you need to listen very deeply to and carefully to those who disagree with you. Maybe they see something you don't. And then listen to them. This is the problem in our own politics. They can do assisted suicide on us if we don't cut it out.
Big question.
Uh-oh, these weren't big?
How do you see the next 20 or 40 years?
I have no idea. I guess I have great faith in the young. I'm devoted to the young. And I spent my life teaching. And I think what you do is, to the best of your ability, you pass on whatever you think you've figured out to the next generation. And then you have faith in them that they will work to sort it out. And I think about what our parents and grandparents, great-grandparents have done. It's amazing. It's amazing. I think of Europe. It's just incredible to be able to travel all across Europe and the prosperity. Yeah, we have a lot of problems, without a doubt. Well, we'll work on them. So yeah, I would say I'm very optimistic. I also think eventually Russians or Chinese are going to reassess, but I don't think it's going to be fast. And so understand that. But there are other parts of the world that aren't in crazy, crazy land, and let's help them to prosper. It's in all of our interests to have prosperous neighbors. And let's help make that happen. And then at the end of your life, you feel good about it. It's like, oh, I helped all these people, you know. You feel good when you retire. It's like, okay. So yeah, I'm optimistic. But on the other hand, we all know that there are horrible human tragedies that go on that'll be part of this. I look at Ukrainians today, all these kids who are missing limbs if they aren't missing their lives, and thinking they should have had prosperous lives, they should have had families, they should have gone on and done other things. But that's not where we're at. So honor their sacrifices, support them. And this idiocy of not providing them their military aid in January when we should have, instead of June at the end of it, that is us doing, helping, that's an assisted suicide moment where we're doing things that are absolutely foolish. How many Ukrainian kids died? Well, they weren't for lack of shells. Okay, let's get smart and not do that.
Is the dumbest thing we could do isolationism then?
I don't know what the dumbest thing is. It would be among them. Yeah, what is it? It's hard to know. Human beings have this capacity. But yeah, isolationism, yeah, it's such a negative view that those who are propounding it, it's as if they dislike so many people, they're scared of so many people. I don't know about their families and the people they've met. I mean, I drive around the United States, and in fact, I've done so many cross-country things. I've met people all over the United States. They're wonderful. So where is this? These evil people they're talking about? I don't know. It's like, I don't know. Watch less TV.
Sally, we can't thank you enough for this. This has been an absolutely educational program, to say the least. You know, I've learned more from reading your stuff, I think, than I have anything else, and this has been a great presentation today. Let me just add one more thing. There will be a review of this over at the OSHER office, just down the street. Go out the front door, turn right. It's less than 5 minutes down there, up on the 3rd floor, where you have the opportunity to meet with each other and kind of kick this all back and forth and learn something from it. So thank you very much for your attendance today, and thank you, Sally, for a fabulous performance.
My pleasure.